The USS Halcyon floated lifelessly 120 miles off the San Diego coast, a $4.3 billion monument to human ingenuity turned into a 9-ton paperweight. The Navy's most advanced destroyer, equipped with a state-of-the-art hybrid propulsion system, electric turbines, gas propulsion, and an adaptive AI interface, was dead in the water. For 2 days, the crew had battled a propulsion failure during a classified training exercise, and the ship's engine room, a maze of gleaming steel and blinking consoles, was a pressure cooker of frustration. The air reeked of burnt rubber and desperation as 10 of the Navy's top engineers, both uniformed and civilian, hovered over diagnostic stations, their uniforms damp with sweat. Software updates had been pushed, circuit boards replaced, the AI reinitialized twice. Nothing worked. Lieutenant Neil Darby stood rigid in the control room, his face pale as he delivered the grim update to Captain Elise Brannan. "Sir, we've lost propulsion again. Main hybrid unit cycled down. Manual restart failed. She's not responding to backup protocols either." The words hung like smoke in the air. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Captain Brannan's boots clicked sharply on the metal floor as she stepped forward, her jaw tight. "Define again, Lieutenant." Darby's voice dropped. "Same as before, ma'am. Total shutdown." Chief Engineer Bradley Tennyson, hunched over a diagnostics panel for hours, let out a low curse without looking up. The Halcyon was supposed to be untouchable, its propulsion system a marvel of secrecy and engineering. Only a handful of cleared engineers even had access to its schematics. Yet here they were, stranded, with weapons offline and comms limited. The crew's morale was sinking faster than the ship's momentum. Captain Brannan paced the briefing room at 0 hours, her voice sharp. "We're not making guesses anymore. Someone outside this circle needs to look at this." Commander Raj Patel, head of the engineering division, shook his head. "That won't sit well with command. They handpicked this team for a reason." Brannan's eyes locked on his, "And yet this team hasn't fixed it." She knew the stakes. The Halcyon was a crown jewel of the Navy. A failure this soon after deployment would send shockwaves through the chain of command, and her career would likely take the first hit. The call went up the ladder, a silent chain reaction of encrypted messages. The Navy's top propulsion consultants were contacted, but one by one they declined. Too little data, too many unknowns, too much risk to their reputations. By day 3, the crew was fraying. Petty Officer Lindsay Roy, the usual comic relief, barely spoke. A fog of failure settled over the ship, heavy as the ocean air. Admiral Clarence Pike sat in his office at Naval Base Point Loma, poring over diagnostics and field reports. His 37-year career had taught him to trust his gut when numbers failed, and something about this didn't add up. He tapped his tablet and said, without looking up, "Get me Raymond Ellis." His assistant froze. "Sir?" Pike's voice was firm. "You heard me. I don't care where he is. Find him." Raymond Ellis hadn't touched a Navy engine in 8 years. Retired quietly, he'd vanished into a rusty garage in Norfolk, Virginia, fixing outboard motors and broken tools for locals. But Pike remembered him, a senior enlisted man who once saved an entire power grid in Bahrain with just a wrench and a sketchbook. No AI, no theories, just a man who listened to machines like they spoke his language. Back on the Halcyon, Captain Brannan stood on the deck, staring at a sea that no longer felt calm. Her calm crackled. "Captain, command has greenlit a consultant. Civilian status, emergency clearance. Eat of 5 hours. Name's Raymond Ellis." She raised an eyebrow, turned, and walked inside without a word. 5 hours on a ship that felt like it was giving up was an eternity. By midday, the Halcyon felt like a ghost ship. The mess hall was silent, conversations dried up, and even the sarcastic young sailors avoided eye contact. In the engine room, the stench of burnt rubber lingered from a blown fuse overnight. The main console was dark, the AI stuck in a diagnostic loop. Commander Patel crouched by the power grid, muttering, "We're missing something fundamental, but I can't figure out what." Civilian contractor Hannah Ewan scrolled through code on her tablet, frowning. "We're looking at this through the lens of perfection. This system was designed in a lab, but ships don't live in labs." Patel sighed. "We need someone who understands chaos." The announcement came over the comms. A civilian consultant was en route, arriving by chopper within the hour. Whispers spread. Some expected an MIT prodigy, others joked about Elon Musk. Only Brannan and a few senior officers knew the name Raymond Ellis. When the Black Hawk landed, a man stepped out in worn boots, a faded Navy windbreaker, and a face etched with time and diesel fumes. A battered notebook hung in his left hand, a stethoscope around his neck. Chief Tennyson squinted. "This the guy?" Ellis ignored him, glancing at the crew. "Where's the engine room?" They descended in silence, boots echoing off bulkheads. Ellis asked 3 questions. "What's she running?" "GE hydrocore hybrid system." Ewan replied, "Last. Gen code with a semi-autonomous diagnostic shell." "What's she not doing?" "Everything," Patel muttered. At the engine room door, Ellis paused, tapped the wall twice, and nodded. "Don't touch anything until I've heard her." Inside, he stepped up to the dead core, a 20-foot beast of turbines and wires. He placed the stethoscope on a junction pipe and stood still for a full minute. The crew exchanged glances, some skeptical, some amused. Ellis straightened and pointed at a young mechanic, Massey, who adjusted the heat sink capacitors after the shutdown. She raised her hand hesitantly. "Me following the default sequence." Ellis shook his head. "You followed it wrong, not your fault. The sequence was designed for clean installs, not a hot core mid-cycle failure." He turned to Patel. "Ever try resetting a circuit while someone's welding the power line? You're restarting a system that's fighting itself. She's locking you out because she's in defense mode." Ewan muttered, "I didn't think that was possible." Ellis scribbled in his notebook. "Most don't, not unless you've seen this system in its first form before they slapped AI on it. This machine's not just complex, she's scared." He gave a tired half-smile. "You've been yelling at her. I'm here to speak her language." Brannan arrived as Ellis guided the crew to rewire the system. No laptop, no data logs, just a wrench and instinct. He peeled back a panel, revealing a charred capacitor. "Wrong type," he said. "Creates a voltage echo the AI can't read. Saw this in 08 on a test platform. They buried it." Brannan folded her arms. "Can it be fixed?" Ellis nodded. "You got solder and a part we can cannibalize from the comm relay." She hesitated. "That's not regulation." He tilted his head. "Neither's being dead in the water for 4 days." She nodded. "Do it." Ellis worked with calm precision, ignoring the impatient engineers. He sat cross-legged, tools laid out, and instructed Petty Officer D'Angelo Morris to pull a relay carefully. "Don't touch the shielding. It's brittle." Morris nodded, moving cautiously. Patel paced. "You think one capacitor's the whole issue?" Ellis shook his head. "It's where it started. The rest is the system reacting to bad info." He held up the old capacitor, nearly identical to the replacement, but flawed inside. She's protecting herself. Every restart made her think she was under attack. Brannon watched silently as Ellis soldered the new part, the sharp tang of melting metal filling the air. He wiped his hands and said, "Cycle the primary. Don't push it. Let her come back on her own." Patel restarted the system. Lights flickered. A low vibration rumbled through the floor. Silence. Ellis listened through his stethoscope. 5 seconds. 10. A click. The diagnostic screen lit up. "Core temperature stabilizing," Ewan said. "Propulsion interface online," Morris added, voice rising. The room held its breath, afraid to jinx it. Brannon spoke. "Mr. Ellis, what did you do?" He shrugged, gave her something she trusted. She was running on a frequency that didn't match her memory. Now she's in tune. The panel glowed green, system after system online. Engineer Riley Brent scoffed. "This doesn't make sense. How'd you know? You didn't guess." Ellis stepped closer, voice low. "I didn't guess, I listened. You ever watch someone bleed out from a cooling system failure? Crawl into a pipe chase with 40 seconds of oxygen because a valve failed? No? Then don't tell me you can't listen to metal and wires." Brent fell silent. The Halcyon glided forward, slow but steady. No lurch, no groan, just a hum. Darby leaned over the control room console. "Sir, we're moving. 0.8 knots. No drag. She's stabilizing." Patel exhaled. "She's back." In the engine room, restrained clapping broke out as systems reported green. Ellis closed his notebook. "I've seen worse," he muttered. Brannon descended the ladder. "You did something no one else could." "We were ready to tug her back to shore." Ellis shook his head. "You'd have dragged back a dead machine. She'd never run right again." Ewan spoke up, "But the specs were changed since 08. Ellis replied, "Specs change, physics don't." Patel leaned in. "You said the system was scared. You meant that literally." Ellis shrugged. "As literal as a machine can be. You give it enough inputs, it draws conclusions. I thought it was under attack, so it locked you out." He tapped his notebook. "You keep building smarter systems, you better remember their bones." Brannon nodded. "You saved this ship." Ellis didn't flinch. "I gave her a second chance." Patel asked, "What now? Rewrite the diagnostic protocol?" Ellis smiled faintly, "Or teach the next guy to use a stethoscope." Laughter broke the tension, relief washing over the room. Ellis tucked his father's old wrench into his pocket. His job was done. As he headed for the deck, Brannon walked with him. "You didn't have to come." He paused. When a ship calls for help, someone should answer. But the fix wasn't the end. At Naval Base Point Loma, reports were filed and questions loomed. Why did $1 billion ship fail? Why did it take a retired chief with no credentials to fix it? Brannon faced urgent review requests, not congratulations. In a coffee-stained briefing room, Patel, Darby, Ewan, and Ellis met. Darby warned, "There's chatter about protocol violations. No documentation. This could be spun as a liability." Ewan nodded. "Even though it worked, it's risky." Ellis leaned back. "Worrying about paperwork over problems gets people hurt." Patel sighed. "We need to protect this from being used against us." Brannon entered, holding a tablet. "They want me on a secure line in 10. They're calling it a systems anomaly, downplaying it." Ellis smirked. "Of course they are." Brannon looked at him. "They're asking how an uncredentialed civilian accessed the propulsion core." Ellis stepped closer. "Tell them the truth. The ship was down, experts failed, and an old man listened and fixed it. Let them choke on it." Brannon nodded. "Transport's inbound. You're off in an hour." Ellis glanced at the engine room's hum. "She's strong again. That's all I care about." Halfway to the chopper, Petty Officer Morris jogged up, holding Ellis's notebook. "You left this?" Ellis took it, nodding. Morris hesitated. "How'd you know the system would respond? That's not in training." Ellis looked him in the eye. "You can't program instinct. You learn systems as they should work. Learn their habits when they don't. Machines hide what's broken. Get quiet, let them tell you." Morris nodded, reverent. "Can I learn that?" Ellis clapped his shoulder. "You just did. Next time, listen first." At the chopper, Brannon approached, less formal. "I forgot what it meant to listen to what's real." Ellis nodded. "Ships lie like people." She asked, "What happens when people like you stop showing up?" He handed her his father's wrench. "It's for the next sailor who thinks they're too young to be right or too old to learn. Keep it safe." As the chopper lifted off, Ellis didn't look back. The Halcyon hummed below, alive again. His notebook stayed closed, but his work wasn't done. The helicopter's blades sliced through the ocean air, kicking up salt spray as it climbed away from the USS Halcyon. Raymond Ellis sat in the jump seat, his notebook resting unopened on his lap, the battered wrench now in Captain Brannon's hands. Below, the ship glided forward, its hum steady, a pulse restored. He didn't look down. There was no need. The Halcyon was alive again, and that was enough. But as the coastline of San Diego emerged on the horizon, a faint unease settled in his chest, not about the ship, but about what he'd left behind. The Navy wasn't just a machine. It was a system of people, and systems, like ships, could hide their flaws. The questions brewing at Naval Base Point Loma were proof of that. Back on the Halcyon, Captain Elise Brannon stood on the deck, the wrench heavy in her hand. She turned it over, its worn grip catching the light. It wasn't just a tool, it was a relic, a reminder of something the Navy had forgotten in its rush toward automation and algorithms. She tucked it into her jacket and headed for the bridge, where Lieutenant Neil Darby waited, his eyes still glued to the propulsion readouts. "She's holding steady, ma'am," he said, voice softer than before. 1.2 knots now. Power curves are climbing." Brannon nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The secure line waiting for her wasn't going to be a pat on the back. It was a reckoning. In the engine room, the crew was still processing the restart. Commander Raj Patel leaned against a bulkhead, staring at the now glowing diagnostic panel. Civilian contractor Hannah Ewan sat cross-legged on the floor, her tablet forgotten beside her. "I still don't get it," she said, breaking the silence. "How does someone hear a machine like that? I've been coding AI for a decade, and I never thought to listen." Patel rubbed his temples. He didn't just hear it, he knew it, like he was part of it. Petty Officer D'Angelo Morris, wiping down a relay housing, looked up. "He said it's about instinct, like the ship's got a personality." Ewan snorted, but there was no edge to it. A personality, it's code and metal. Morris shrugged. "Maybe, but it's code and metal that locked us out until he showed up." The mood was lighter, but not celebratory. The crew knew the fix was only half the battle. The Navy didn't take kindly to anomalies, especially not on a $4 $3 billion destroyer. In the lower deck briefing room, the coffee-stained chairs were still warm from the earlier meeting. Patel, Darby, and Ewan reconvened, this time without Ellis. Darby leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We need to get our story straight. Command's already sniffing around, asking about protocol violations. Pulling that comm relay part, no documentation, that's a problem." Ewan nodded, her voice low, and Ellis wasn't even under contract. If they want to make this a scandal, they've got enough to work with. Patel sighed. He fixed the ship. That should be enough. But they all knew it wasn't. Brannon entered, her face unreadable. They've scheduled a full incident review at Point Loma tomorrow. They're calling it a systems anomaly for now, but they want names, timelines, and explanations, especially about our civilian consultant. She paused, glancing at the team. They're not happy an outsider touched the core. Patel frowned, an outsider who saved their flagship. Brannon's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Doesn't matter, they're circling, we need to be ready. Across the country, Raymond Ellis landed at Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia, the transport jet's engines still whining as he stepped onto the tarmac. The young petty officer who'd driven him to the base days earlier was waiting, offering another crisp salute. Raymond waved it off. Save it for someone who's still in the game. The kid hesitated, then grinned. Heard you got the Halcyon moving again, Chief. That true? Raymond gave a curt nod. She's moving. That's all that matters. He climbed into the SUV, the notebook under his arm, and stared out the window as they drove toward Norfolk. The coastline blurred past, but his mind was still on the ship's hum, its resistance, the way it fought to protect itself. Back in his garage, the familiar smell of oil, salt, and rust greeted him like an old friend. The rusted fan coughed in the corner, and the 1968 Johnson V4 outboard he'd been working on sat untouched. He set the notebook on the workbench next to a black and white photo of him and Jeanette, his late wife, taken on a San Diego pier. Her smile in the frame was the only thing in the room that didn't carry the weight of time. He sat on a stool, staring at the notebook. He hadn't opened it since the Halcyon. For a moment, he considered leaving it closed, letting the ship's fix be the end of it. But something nagged at him, not pride, not duty, but a sense that this wasn't over. On the Halcyon, the crew was settling back into routine, but the tension lingered. In the mess hall, conversations were muted. Lindsay Roy, usually quick with a joke, picked at her food. Feels like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop, she said to no one in particular. Across the table, a young ensign nodded. Command's not gonna let this slide. You don't lose a ship like this and just move on. In the engine room, Morris was quieter than usual, replaying Ellis's words in his head. Get quiet. Let the machine tell you what's wrong. He'd never thought of a ship as something that could hide its pain, but now he couldn't unsee it. Brannon sat in her quarters, the secure line call fresh in her mind. The Admiral on the other end hadn't shouted, but his tone was ice. You let an uncredentialed civilian access the propulsion core, Captain. Explain. She'd kept her voice steady. He fixed it when no one else could. The ship's moving, that's the result. The Admiral wasn't impressed. Results don't erase process. We need a full report by 0800 tomorrow. Every step, every decision, every name. She'd hung up, feeling the weight of the wrench in her pocket. Ellis's words echoed, tell the truth. Let them choke on it. At Point Loma, Admiral Clarence Pike was fielding his own questions. A senior officer from the Pentagon had called, voice clipped. You pulled a retired chief out of nowhere, Clarence. No clearance, no credentials. Why? Pike leaned back in his chair, unfazed. Because he's the only one who could hear the ship. You read the report. She's moving again. The officer wasn't satisfied. This isn't 1985. We don't fix billion-dollar systems with wrenches and gut feelings. This could have been a disaster. Pike's jaw tightened. It was a disaster until he showed up. He ended the call, knowing the fallout was just beginning. In Norfolk, Raymond was elbow deep in the Johnson outboard when his landline rang. He wiped his hands, expecting another recruiter or maybe Pike with a debrief. Instead, a woman's voice came through, measured but urgent. "Mr. Ellis, this is Commander Lion Cho, Naval Engineering School, Gulfport. I heard what you did on the Halcyon. I'm heading a training revision task force, and I'd like you to talk to our trainees. Not a lecture, just a conversation about what doesn't make it into manuals." Raymond sat on the stool, the receiver heavy in his hand. "I'm not recruiting," he said flatly. Cho was quick. "I know you're done. I'm not asking you to sign up. I'm asking you to share what you know." He didn't answer right away. The garage was quiet except for the fan's rattle. He glanced at the photo of Jeanette, then at the notebook. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Cho didn't push. "That's all I ask." After hanging up, he stood in the doorway, watching a city bus roll by, a kid on a bike weaving through parked cars. Normal life. But the Halcyon's hum lingered in his mind, a reminder that some calls don't stop just because you walk away. On the Halcyon, Brannon called another meeting in the briefing room. Patel, Darby, and Ewan sat around the table, faces tense. "The report's due in 12 hours, Brannon said. "We need to be clear on what we say about Ellis. If we're not careful, they'll bury him, and us." Darby leaned forward. "We say he was a last resort. Experts failed, we were out of options. He had Pike's clearance." Ewan shook her head. "That's not enough. They'll dig into why we didn't catch the capacitor issue ourselves. We need to admit the system's design has blind spots." Patel frowned. "That's admitting the Navy built a flaw into a flagship." Brannon's voice was firm. "We don't lie. We say what happened. The system locked us out, and Ellis knew why. If they want to crucify someone, it won't be us." In Norfolk, Raymond opened his notebook for the first time since the Halcyon. The pages were yellowed, smudged with ink and fingerprints from decades of work. He flipped to a blank page and began writing, "Things the ship won't tell you." Below, he listed truths, not procedures. "A relay about to die sounds sluggish, not sharp. A pump surging 3 times in 10 seconds means shut it down. The 4th surge hurts someone. Don't trust a screen until you've touched the wire." The words came slowly, each one a memory of a machine he'd coaxed back to life. He wasn't writing for himself. He was writing for the next sailor who'd face a silent ship and a room full of doubt. Back on the Halcyon, Morris was in the engine room, staring at the hybrid core. He'd borrowed a stethoscope from the medical bay, feeling foolish but curious. He pressed it to a junction pipe, mimicking Ellis. Nothing, just faint vibrations. He tried again, closing his eyes, listening harder. A low hum, uneven, like a heartbeat skipping. He didn't know what it meant, but for the first time, he felt the ship wasn't just a machine. It was something alive, something with secrets. He jotted a note in his log, "Listened today, didn't hear much, will try again." At Point Loma, Pike received a preliminary report from Brannon. It was blunt, unapologetic. Propulsion failure due to incompatible capacitor type, creating a voltage echo. I misread the issue as a threat, initiating lockdown. Civilian consultant Raymond Ellis identified and corrected the fault using field experience. Pike smiled faintly. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered. But he knew the Pentagon would hate it. They'd want flowcharts, data logs, anything to make the failure sound clinical, not human. He forwarded the report with a note. Recommend reviewing design protocols for hybrid systems. Experience still matters. In Norfolk, Raymond's phone rang again the next morning. "Commander Cho," persistent but not pushy. "Have you thought about it?" she asked. He looked at the new notebook, 5 pages filled with lessons no manual would teach. "I'll come," he said, "but no podiums, just a room, some chairs, and kids who want to listen." Cho's voice brightened. "That's more than enough." He hung up, feeling the weight of the decision. He wasn't going back to the Navy. He was going to the machines, and the people who needed to hear them. On the Halcyon, Brannon stood alone in her quarters, the wrench on her desk. She drafted the report, sticking to Ellis's advice. The truth, no sugarcoating. But she knew the fallout was coming. The Navy didn't like being reminded of its flaws, especially not by someone who'd walked away from it. She picked up the wrench, feeling its weight. For the next sailor who thinks they're too young to be right or too old to learn. She placed it in a drawer, locked it, and vowed to keep it safe. In Gulfport, preparations began for Raymond's visit. Commander Cho briefed her trainees, a group of young engineers fresh from tech schools, their heads full of algorithms and simulations. "He's not here to lecture," she told them. "He's here to teach you what the manuals don't. Pay attention." The trainees whispered among themselves, skeptical but curious. They'd heard about the Halcyon, about the old man who fixed it with a wrench and a stethoscope. Some thought it was a myth, others wondered if he was the last of a dying breed. Raymond spent the evening in his garage, packing for Gulfport. He didn't take much, just the new notebook and the old stethoscope. The photo of Jeanette stayed on the wall, her smile a quiet anchor. He thought about Morris, about Brannon, about the Halcyon's hum. He'd fixed the ship, but the real work was just beginning. Machines didn't just break, they spoke. And someone had to teach the next generation how to listen. As the Halcyon sailed toward its next waypoint, the crew felt the ship's rhythm return, but the questions lingered. Who would take the blame? How would the Navy rewrite this story? And what would happen when the truth about the Halcyon's failure reached the top? Raymond's notebook held the answers, but it was up to others to read it. The USS Halcyon cut through the Pacific, its engines humming with a steadiness that felt almost defiant after days of silence. The crew moved with renewed purpose, but an undercurrent of unease lingered. The ship was alive again, but the questions swirling around its failure were far from settled. In her quarters, Captain Elise Brannon sat at her desk, the report to Naval Command finalized and sent. The old wrench Raymond Ellis had given her rested in a locked drawer, a quiet reminder of the truth she'd committed to paper. A multi-billion-dollar warship had been saved by a retired chief with no credentials, a man who listened when no one else could. She knew the fallout was coming, and it wouldn't be gentle. In Norfolk, Virginia, Raymond Ellis stood in his garage, packing a small duffel for Gulfport. The new notebook, its pages already filling with hard-earned truths, sat next to the battered stethoscope. The black-and white photo of Jeanette watched over him, her smile steady in the dim light. He didn't feel like a hero, nor did he want to. Fixing the Halcyon wasn't about glory. It was about responsibility. But Commander Lion Cho's call had stirred something deeper, a sense that his work wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about the people who'd come after him, the ones who'd face their own silent ships someday. He zipped the bag, glanced at Jeanette's photo, and stepped into the night. On the Halcyon, the crew was settling into the rhythm of a ship reborn. In the engine room, Petty Officer D'Angelo Morris lingered after his shift, the borrowed stethoscope around his neck. He pressed it to a junction pipe, listening as Ellis had. The hum was steady now, but he strained to hear beyond it, searching for the secrets Ellis had spoken of. He didn't understand it yet, but he wrote in his log, listened again. Heard something this time, a pulse maybe, need to keep trying. Across the ship, others felt the shift. Lindsay Roy cracked a joke in the mess hall, and a few sailors laughed, the sound breaking the fog of the past days. But Commander Raj Patel and civilian contractor Hannah Ewan were still in the briefing room, poring over the report. We told the truth, Ewan said, her voice low, but will they hear it? Patel shook his head. They'll hear what they want to hear. At Naval Base Point Loma, Admiral Clarence Pike sat in his office, the Halcyon's report open on his tablet. The Pentagon's response had come faster than expected, a terse message demanding a full briefing. Why was the failure undetected? Why was an outsider involved? What does this say about our systems? Pike leaned back, his jaw tight. He'd backed Ellis because he knew the man could do what no one else could, but the Navy didn't reward instinct, it rewarded protocol. He drafted a response, keeping it sharp. The ship is operational. The consultant was cleared under my authority. Recommend immediate review of hybrid system design protocols. He hit send, knowing it wouldn't be enough to quiet the storm. In Gulfport, Mississippi, the Naval Engineering School buzzed with anticipation. Commander Lion Cho had gathered her trainees in a hangar, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. No podium, no projector, just as Raymond had requested. The young engineers, fresh from tech schools, whispered among themselves. They'd heard the rumors about the Halcyon, about the retired chief who fixed it with a wrench and a stethoscope. Some thought it was exaggerated, a Navy tall tale. Others, like Ensign Tara Nguyen, felt a spark of curiosity. If he's real, she said to a colleague, he's got to know something we don't. Cho overheard and smiled faintly. He knows what the manuals forgot. Raymond arrived at dusk, the Gulfport air thick with humidity. He stepped into the hangar, duffel slung over his shoulder, notebook in hand. The trainees fell silent, their eyes tracking him. He didn't look like much. Worn boots, faded windbreaker, creased face. But there was a weight to him, a quiet authority that didn't need a uniform. Cho greeted him with a handshake. Thanks for coming, Mr. Ellis. They're ready to listen. Raymond nodded, setting his bag down. Hope so. I'm not here to lecture. He took a seat, the circle closing around him, and opened the notebook. I fixed a ship a few days ago. He began, his voice like gravel over steel. The Halcyon, she was dead in the water, and nobody knew why. Not the engineers, not the AI, not the manuals. I'm not here to tell you how I did it. I'm here to tell you why you need to learn to do it yourselves. The trainees leaned in, notebooks open, pens poised. Nguyen raised her hand. They said you used a stethoscope. Is that true? Raymond held up the old tool, its rubber dulled to gray. This and my ears. Machines talk, but you've got to know how to listen. He didn't talk about circuits or code. He talked about rhythm, about the sluggish hum of a failing relay, the uneven pulse of a pump about to surge. Your screens will lie to you. He said, they'll show green when the ship's screaming. Touch the wires. Feel the vibrations. Trust what the machine tells you over what the manual says. The trainees scribbled furiously, but Nguyen just watched, her eyes locked on him. She saw something in his calm, something her simulations and algorithms couldn't teach. Back on the Halcyon, Brannan faced the secure line again. The Admiral's voice was colder this time. Your report's thorough, Captain, but it raises questions. The capacitor issue should have been caught. The AI should have flagged it. and yet it took a civilian to see it. Why? Brannan gripped the wrench in her pocket. Because he listened to the ship, sir. Our systems are too complex to trust blindly. We need people who can hear the flaws. The Admiral paused, then softened. You're not wrong, but this won't go away quietly. Expect a board of inquiry. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Understood, sir. In Gulfport, Raymond fielded questions for hours. A trainee asked about the Halcyon's AI. It's smart. Raymond said, but it's not wise. It locked the crew out because it thought it was under attack. You can't program instinct out of a machine any more than you can program it into a person. Another trainee, a skeptical young man named Carter, crossed his arms. So we're supposed to throw out our training and just listen. Raymond didn't flinch. Your training's fine, but it's a map, not the terrain. The ship's the terrain. Learn its habits, not just its specs. Yen stayed after the others left, grease still on her coveralls. Mr. Ellis, she said, hesitant, do you think machines remember us? He chuckled, the sound low and warm. Maybe, but the better question is, will you remember them? He handed her his old notebook, the one from the Halcyon, its pages yellowed and smudged. Copy what you want, but only if you plan to add to it. She took it like it was a sacred text, nodding slowly. Back in Norfolk, Raymond returned to his garage, the rusted fan still coughing. A package waited on his workbench, no return address. Inside was a shadow box with a photo of the Halcyon's engine room, post-repair. Mounted beside it was a replica of his father's wrench, a plaque reading, "This tool stopped a warship from going silent." He smiled, setting it next to Jeanette's photo. The new notebook sat open, more pages filled. If the ship feels different, it probably is. Don't ignore it. He didn't feel proud, just useful in a way he hadn't been since Jeanette passed. On the Halcyon, the board of inquiry began. Brannan, Patel, and Ewan faced a panel of senior officers, their questions relentless. Why wasn't the capacitor issue in the design logs? Why did the AI fail to diagnose it? Why was an outsider given access? Brannan answered each one, her voice steady. The system was designed in a lab, but it lives on a ship. Flaws hide in the gaps. Raymond Ellis saw them because he spent a lifetime listening to those gaps. The panel wasn't satisfied, but they couldn't argue with the result. The Halcyon was moving. Weeks later, a directive came down from Naval Command. Hybrid system protocols were to be reviewed with a focus on field-based diagnostics. A quiet nod to Ellis, though his name was never mentioned. At Gulfport, Nguyen and her peers began incorporating his lessons, using stethoscopes alongside tablets, listening to pumps and relays in training exercises. Morris, back on the Halcyon, kept his log, noting every hum, every vibration. He didn't hear everything yet, but he was learning. Raymond sat in his garage one evening, the radio murmuring low. He opened the new notebook, adding one last line. The ship doesn't care about your rank or your screen. It cares if you hear it. He closed it, leaned back, and looked at Jeanette's photo. I'm still listening, he said softly. The Halcyon story would fade into Navy whispers, buried in reports or spun into a sanitized victory. But for those who'd been there, Brannan, Morris knew. The truth lived on. It wasn't in the manuals or the algorithms. It was in the habit of listening, passed from one sailor to the next, like a wrench handed down through time.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.